Welcome back to Jewish News Syndicate. We're sitting here with Colonel Richard Kemp, a former British Army commander who was in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, and spends a lot of time in Israel, liaising and working with the Israeli military and defending Israel in the public sector, on the media, and elsewhere. Colonel Kemp, welcome to JNS.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, I was going to call you Richard because
I thought you were going to call me Rabbi.
No, but maybe next time we'll call you Rabbi. You're actually not Jewish, but you've been a staunch defender of the state of Israel. You know, what causes somebody that's not an Israeli citizen, not a member of the Jewish faith, to have so much support for Israel? I mean, you've put so much time and energy into defending the Jewish state and the IDF.
Well, you don't have to be Jewish and you don't have to be Israeli to understand that Israel's fight is the fight of the whole of the Western world. Israel's fighting at the very front line of a conflict that faces us all and in some cases engulfs us all. And I think that knowing how much Israel is vilified, criticized, and subjected to double standards, I think it's important that those of us who understand hopefully what we're talking about, who have experience of this kind of conflict, are able to try and bring some truth to the discussion on Israel and Israel's conflicts.
Why all the vilification and double standards?
Well, it starts fundamentally. There's a big story, but fundamentally it starts with the narrative, the propaganda campaign against Israel that began in the 1960s that tells us that Israel is illegitimate. Israel stole Arab land. Israel is illegal occupiers. Israel has illegal settlements. Israel is an apartheid state, all of which are lies. But that has taken hold. That's taken hold of the narrative in so much of the Western world. And the media basically operate within that framework. So pretty much anything that Israel has done to it, like the 7th of October, it had it coming because of all these crimes it's committed. And anything Israel does to defend itself against that, Israel's in the wrong. And that is the start point. There are many other factors involved in it, but that's the fundamental problem that Israel's in at the moment.
Well, you've been a sort of unofficial spokesperson at many points, speaking to all kind of groups, media, decision makers. You know, what's the main message that you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I try to explain when I speak to, whether it's the university campuses, whether it's in a government, to a government minister or to a politician, or whether it's in any place really, I try to make it clear what the reality is about the Israel's situation. The fact that Israel is fighting not only a just war, but it's fighting it in an entirely lawful way, despite all the lies that are told about it. And that Western countries, Western democracies, and the political leaders in those democracies have an absolute responsibility to stamp on these lies and do all that they can to support Israel in this fight, because they can be assured that this fight is coming to them as well. It's not just Israel's fight, it's all of our fight, and they're going to be on the receiving end of it, particularly if let's say Israel didn't win this war in Gaza, which it's going to, but let's say it didn't, then that would embolden, encourage, and it would cause the spread of Islamic jihad around the world.
And certainly there's a lot of Muslims in Europe and elsewhere. And we've seen how they've come out and protest Israel in support of Palestinians, in support of Hamas. But when you are talking to government officials, to college campuses, and you're telling them about the justness of Israel's war, you're not just taking IDF talking points. You're not taking Israel's word for it. You've spent a lot of time actually inside the Gaza Strip during this war. How much days have you spent inside Gaza since October 7th?
I've been there numerous times in Gaza, I think 7 or 8 times, something like that. And I've seen the fighting firsthand. I've seen what the IDF is doing. I've seen what Hamas and the other terrorists in Gaza are doing. So I can take that firsthand vision of what's happening there, and I can kind of process it alongside my own 30-year understanding of warfare and experience in warfare. And then I can communicate that to the people that don't have that insight and don't have that knowledge, and I can show them or explain to them, shall we say, that, as I mentioned before, Israel is fighting not only a just war, but it's fighting it in a lawful way. And the accusations leveled against Israel, like unlawful killing on a large scale, like starvation of the population in Gaza, are simply lies.
What have you seen? I mean, to disprove that.
Well, I've seen the IDF fighting, and I'll give you one example. I saw, I was present inside Gaza in a IDF division command group, with about 20, 30 officers gathered around in a largely ruined building in Gaza, discussing a forthcoming operation to destroy a high-value target that happened to be in or close to a school that was being used for refugees, to house civilian refugees. And of the conversation, they took at least half of the time they spent discussing the complex military operation. They were discussing how best to achieve that while minimizing the prospects of killing innocent civilians. So this is not just IDF talking points when people talk about how they try to avoid innocent civilian deaths, but it's actually what they're thinking and what they're discussing and planning for on the ground during a operation. And so I'll give you examples of a few of the things they've done. I mean, in this situation, it wasn't quite like that, but very often the IDF use leaflet drops. They send text messages, they make phone calls, they send voice messages, they send radio messages to people who are in a danger area when the IDF are planning to attack, and they warn them to leave. And not only warn them to leave, but they tell them what route to take and where to go to be safer. Nothing is entirely safe on the battlefield, where to be safer. And these sort of measures then are subject to surveillance from drones, from aircraft, and indeed from the ground sometimes, to confirm that the people have left before the IDF carry out the strike. And these sort of measures that the IDF are taking, they're unprecedented. No other army has ever done anything even remotely like this to achieve the objective of destroying the enemy while minimizing civilian casualties.
Doesn't it make it much harder to defeat the enemy? Isn't Hamas actually banking on this?
Hamas's entire strategy is based around human shields, or perhaps more accurately, human sacrifices, because they don't just want to deter the Israelis from attacking or make it more complicated for the Israelis to attack, but they also want, if the Israelis do attack, they want their own civilians killed. It's the first army in the history of warfare that I know of that has deliberately used its own civilian population as weapons against their enemy. So that's exactly what Hamas want, and it's exactly what the IDF try and avoid. And IDF soldiers have died fighting to try and prevent the deaths of innocent civilians. So it's not just makes the IDF operations more complex and maybe delays things and maybe results in some terrorists getting away who shouldn't, but IDF soldiers actually make a sacrifice themselves to prevent the loss of innocent civilian lives.
You know, Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th. They killed 1,200 people. They injured thousands others. They took over 250 hostages. And the IDF had to go into Gaza primarily, I mean, not just to root out Hamas, but also to try to find its hostages. And there's a lot of Israelis that would think that all of the measures that Israel's gone to in order to protect Palestinian civilians at the expense, at the cost of the lives of Israeli soldiers. And this is not a professional army by and large. There is a professional army component, but it's a civilian army. I mean, these are just people. Everybody is a son, everybody is a brother, a father, a colleague, a good friend. There are Israelis here that would say it's immoral that the IDF is understandably sacrificing its own soldiers in order to protect Palestinian civilians.
I can see that argument, but the IDF, like the British Army, the American Army, like any Western army, they are bound by the laws of war. They have to fight according to the laws of war. And what that means is that it doesn't mean they can't inadvertently kill innocent civilians, because they can under the laws of war, if as long as they're not targeting those civilians, as long as they take all measures possible to get the civilians out of a danger area, and as long as the attack, the potential harm to civilians is proportionate to the military objective that the IDF is trying to achieve, then it is still lawful if you carry out that operation and civilians die. But they are obliged to do these things, just like every other army.
But you're saying that Israel is taking unprecedented measures.
Israel goes above and beyond any other army that I'm aware of.
And I imagine, in your view, that other militaries are going to be studying what Israel's done now as a new sort of gold standard for how to try to avoid civilian casualties in war. And yet, on the same time, while you're saying that Israel's gone to unprecedented measures to reduce civilian casualties, on the other side, the vilification and the double standards that you're talking about, I mean, they make it sound like Israel, I mean, they have accused Israel in the international community of a genocide.
Yeah, which of course is an obscenity to accuse Israel of that. I mean, Israel's a country that knows all about genocide. It was built partly on the backs of survivors of genocide. The last thing that Israel, the IDF, would do is to work towards committing a genocide. The people who are committing the genocide are Hamas, or attempting to commit genocide. It's in their charter, the killing of Jews in Israel and then around the world. That's part of their charter. They enacted that on the 7th of October. That's what they wanted to achieve. They just wanted to kill Jews, civilians, soldiers, anything. The words of their leaders confirm that they are after a genocide. They are the genociders here. The IDF are the exact opposite of that. So it's a direct lie perpetrated or perpetuated by people such as the Republic of South Africa, who brought charges to the International Court of Justice, and the court itself for entertaining such a horrific accusation.
You've been inside Gaza. Did you get down into the underground tunnel system that Hamas built?
I've been into some of the tunnels underneath Gaza.
What impressed you about those tunnels?
Well, they're almost not, I wouldn't say a miracle of engineering, but they're a great feat of engineering. They're not kind of tunnels you would envision on a battlefield where you might crawl through them. These are tunnels they're concrete floor, concrete lining, concrete ceiling. They've got electric cable, they've got air conditioning, they've got anything you need to survive inside a tunnel as a terrorist. You can walk down them. In some, you can drive cars down the tunnel. And they're also compartmentalized by heavy blast walls and blast doors to make it that much more difficult for an IDF attacking force to get through the tunnel. They've got to blow the wall down, blow the doors off and all that. And then they've got hidden cameras in some places in some of the walls, which are monitored by someone with a tablet some distance away. And as soon as an IDF unit or an individual goes by, they press the button on the phone or on the tablet and the explosive goes up. So it's extraordinarily difficult to fight in these conditions. And I think when the IDF went into Gaza, they made a decision they would not fight in the tunnels because it was so difficult. Then over time, they learned how to do it, and they developed some remarkable tactics to fight concurrently and in close coordination underground, on the ground, and in the air.
Can you discuss a little bit about those tactics? How does the IDF fight in the tunnels?
Well, I don't think I can go into much detail on that, frankly, because I think the IDF would prefer the details of the way they fight in tunnels to be kept internal. But they essentially use a huge amount of technology, including drones. They use dogs. They use remote cameras, and I think that's kind of relatively standard tunnel fighting, if it could be called standard. But it's a very tough thing to. I mean, first of all, military communications underground are by definition extremely difficult. So they've had to develop systems for doing that, for being able to communicate with aircraft or with troops on the ground, and actually coordinate. I mean, I've never fought in a tunnel myself or fought in a tunnel system, but I have fought in operations in which you've got to coordinate a range of ground forces, tanks, infantry, artillery, combat aircraft, whether it's helicopters or whether it's fighter planes, and all these things in a hostile environment. It's very difficult to coordinate. Yet they've done it, and in addition to that, coordinated the operations underground. And one of the big problems in this kind of complex operation is soldiers killing their own soldiers, which is unfortunately quite a common feature of most wars. And so they've developed these very elaborate means of trying to maximize the destruction of the enemy. minimize the prospect of killing any hostages, some of whom have been kept in tunnels, minimizing the prospect of killing civilians, and at the same time killing the maximum number of enemy.
What's your assessment regarding entrances to tunnels and also storage houses for weapons and their placement within civilian infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, I've been into houses in Gaza, and I've seen underneath a child's bed, I've seen rifles. In the kitchen cupboard, I've seen boxes of grenades. I've seen boxes of explosives in people's houses where they're living. Not only that, but what that does is to allow Hamas terrorists to do something that no terrorists I've ever fought against have been able to do, which is to move around above ground, not only in civilian clothes, which is common terrorist tactic, but without a weapon. How do you identify a terrorist? The main way to identify a terrorist is the rifle he's carrying. A terrorist can't do much without a rifle or a pistol or a grenade or something. So that's the kind of indicator that someone among a civilian population is a terrorist. But they don't do that because they know they can go to this house, to that house, to the other house.
And how well is that mapped out, like for Hamas? They know where everything is located.
Yeah, they will know in an area. They'll know where things are, and they can be pretty confident they can go into not any house, but almost any house, and they'll find munitions. Because in some parts, every house, every other house, every third house has munitions in them. The whole place, the whole of almost all of the Gaza Strip, whether it be civilian houses, whether it be mosques, whether it be hospitals, schools, these are all part of of Hamas's fortifications. And not only that, but if you go into a house, if you're an IDF soldier, you go into a house. I mentioned the hidden explosives and cameras in the tunnels. The same thing is in the houses as well. I was talking to a young IDF commander the other day who was telling me he got blown up. He got a lot of his stomach blown out by one of these remote cameras that was concealed. This makes it, I think, when the dust settles, shall we say, on Gaza, I think we're going to witness probably even more visions of destruction than we've seen so far, of destruction by the IDF against these buildings. And that is primarily because of the fortification of these buildings and the use of them as armories, tunnel entrances coming up into the houses, all of that.
Well, if you're saying that it's almost all the houses, or at least more than
a significant number, yeah.
Like more than 50%,
probably.
So what does that do to the claim of the innocent Palestinian civilian, right? People talk about Hamas and then they say, innocent Palestinian civilians. I mean, if there's weapons and tunnel entrances in the majority of civilian buildings in Gaza, that means that the whole population is complicit.
I'm sure the whole population or most of the population of Gaza is complicit in some way, whether it's just turning a blind eye, physically helping, assisting, and all that sort of thing. Or even if it's looking out for IDF soldiers approaching and warning off the terrorists. But that what that doesn't mean is that the IDF can consider all Gazan civilians as combatants. They can't, and they don't. When a civilian actively assists and is known to be actively assisting terrorist action, military action, then they become combatants and they can be attacked and should be attacked. But you can't. It's actually difficult to identify that, and so you have to regard them until you can see otherwise as civilians who can't be attacked.
Israel's been forced to pause the fighting in the Gaza Strip at certain points, whether that was to turn their attention onto Hezbollah in the north, and then obviously to negotiate ceasefires as part of an attempt to bring hostages home. But it's clear from the fact that rockets continue to be fired, even though at a much slower clip than before, or that we see Hamas kind of regrouping, that the fight is not finished. I mean, what, in your assessment, what percentage of victory has Israel accomplished so far? What's left to accomplish?
Well, I would say very, very roughly that maybe Israel's dealt with 80% of the problem in Gaza. There's a significant amount. Well, 20% is a lot, but they've dealt with, let's say 80%, and they've killed huge numbers of Hamas terrorists. I think the latest estimate I saw was that by the IDF is they've killed somewhere between 20 and 25,000 terrorists, probably more. And that accounts for a significant amount of Hamas's fighting capability. But Hamas have also been trying to rebuild, and they've used the period of the ceasefire, the recent ceasefire, to help them rebuild. But they're not going to get back to anywhere near where they were before, and particularly if Israel now maintains very significant pressure. So Israel's got to now eliminate the remaining Hamas terrorists, and they won't get rid of all of them. They obviously need and are focusing on the leadership, both of the Hamas fighting element and also the governing element of Hamas, which is also legitimate targets. They're all part of a terrorist organization.
Do you think there's going to be a renewed ground operation inside Gaza?
I would expect that to be the case. I don't see any alternative short of Hamas surrendering and handing over the hostages. The likelihood of that happening, I would say, is relatively remote. It's not an impossibility. And we've seen, I think, even in the last days, we've seen some pretty serious protests against Hamas inside Gaza. So I'm not saying that's kind of the beginning of the end for Hamas.
But that's not really making mainstream media headlines.
Of course, it doesn't fit it doesn't fit the narrative of so much of the mainstream media. They don't, the Hamas is so often, maybe not in words like this, but are portrayed as being the heroic resistance to the Israeli occupation, which of course lies. But the reality is that the people of Gaza, I think most of the people of Gaza, I would say, I don't know this for sure, but certainly a large number, cheered on the 7th of October. They wanted Hamas to succeed against Israel on the 7th of October. But they've also now seen what Hamas has brought down on them. And so there has been some dissatisfaction. I believe that's growing as the Israelis intensify their current operation.
You must have seen a lot of the destruction by the IDF of Gazan infrastructure, civilian buildings, schools, hospitals, all types of buildings that have been used as really military bases inside the Gaza Strip. Tell me, how you've witnessed Israel have to learn on the ground and change tactics in order to figure out, how they're going to defeat this enemy and how they're going to take down buildings, especially when the international community, the Biden administration, didn't really want the IDF using air power to be destroying buildings all up and down the Strip, which obviously would have been much easier.
I think the IDF, I've got a great deal of admiration for the IDF. And I think their soldiers are incredibly brave and incredibly committed to defending their homeland. But I think one of the most impressive attributes of the IDF is their flexibility and their readiness to learn in a way that I haven't seen before in armed forces. And for example, I've visited some formations inside Gaza where every night they will have kind of like a debrief across the whole of the forces in Gaza, with commanders talking about the lessons they've learned from the day and adaptations necessary in their tactics in order to be more effective the next day. So this sort of thing has, I think, been extremely beneficial to the IDF, as it enabled their great. And let's not forget the success of the IDF in Gaza. Many people don't want to really admit it, particularly outside Israel, but the success of the IDF in Gaza can be seen by the fact that they have, I believe, according to IDF estimates, killed around about 20,000+ terrorists, with relatively few Israeli deaths. Now, there have been too many, and every one is a tragedy, whether the IDF soldiers killed or wounded, that is tragic. But compared to, I think, what the IDF expected at the beginning, it's been relatively small.
What's been your experience in the past as a commander in terms of how many soldiers are lost, especially when you're fighting on enemy territory?
Well, I think my own personal experience is a rather different situation, because we've been fighting, whether it was in Northern Ireland or whether it was in Afghanistan or Iraq, we've been fighting with absolutely overwhelming superiority. And the number of soldiers we had quite a few soldiers over the years killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it was a much more it wasn't anything like as long. Well, the fighting wasn't anything as long term and is more important, is intense has been going on in Gaza. So, but I think you can. I think in the military we use a kind of rough rule of thumb that if you're an attacking force like the IDF going into Gaza, you can expect to sustain 3 times as many casualties as the enemy you're fighting, the defenders, roughly rule of thumb. And it's been much more than the opposite of that in Gaza.
I mean, it's not even 3 times more enemy combatants to Israeli soldiers. I mean, it's dramatically less than
dramatically less, yeah. So it's I think it says, and when you consider that Hamas have had decades to prepare Gaza with the fortification of houses, the weapons stashes, the getaway routes, the sniper positions, the ambush positions, the booby traps, all of this, I think it's...
But it seems that the Hamas strategy was to defeat the IDF on two methods. Number one, if the IDF would kill just civilian after civilian and the counts would go up, that the international community would force the IDF to stop in its tracks, and that's how they get a victory. And at the same token, if they would have killed hundreds, if not thousands of soldiers, that Israel would lose the stomach for continuing the fight. I mean, Is this the Hamas strategy, basically?
Yeah, and the fundamental part of their strategy is the first thing you said, which is to get the world to close in on Israel and stop the fight from taking place by the deaths of civilians inside Gaza. And we've seen that. We've seen immense pressure from the United States, from Europe, from other countries on Israel to stop fighting. We've seen that pressure exercised in a number of different ways. And we've seen it encouraged in the media, and politicians being almost forced to speak against Israel and condemn Israel by the media coverage. And that, and not just the media, not just politicians, but the United Nations and various other international bodies who themselves are playing a role in this. They have blood on their hands, particularly the United Nations, particularly things like the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. They have blood on their hands because what they're doing is encouraging Hamas to keep fighting, to keep bringing about the situation where civilians die, rather than condemning Hamas. There's nothing to condemn Israel for, frankly. There's a lot to condemn Hamas for, but how often do you see the condemnation of Hamas? You see the encouragement of Hamas.
How does that also affect hostage negotiations?
Well, it has a big effect on hostage negotiations. Because I mean, the hostage negotiations have been one of not just the negotiations, but the actual presence of the hostages have been a major factor in this war. And again, I don't know of any parallel conflict where hostages have been such a significant element of a conflict like this, and it clearly has slowed down and deterred many aspects of Israeli operations, because the last thing, of course, they want to do is to kill hostages or cause Hamas to kill hostages. So that's been a major impediment to military operations, and the IDF have been doing all they can throughout the conflict, as well as the negotiation phase, been all they can throughout the conflict to try and get these hostages back. Probably the single most difficult military operation you could imagine. I've been involved in several hostage rescue operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, most of which failed. And they fail because you need 2 things which are so difficult to achieve. One, you need pinpoint intelligence on where the hostages are and how they're being kept. Secondly, you need the element of surprise, because, of course, those people holding the hostages, they've got a gun to their head. They will kill them as soon as they detect IDF activity anywhere. And that makes it so difficult and explains why relatively few hostages have been released by the IDF.
So we have to deal with the hostages. We have to deal with the pressure from the international community. You have to deal with the booby trapping of the entirety of the Gaza Strip. And also there were weapons shortages and resupply issues, especially when President Biden was and his administration were dealing with Prime Minister Netanyahu and the war. What's your view of how the Prime Minister has handled all of the military and diplomatic pressures of fighting this war?
I think the Prime Minister of Israel has the most difficult job of anybody in the world. I can't imagine any more difficult, and it's difficult by significant measure. And he's got, you mentioned all the different factors involved in what he has to deal with. Plus, of course, Israeli domestic politics, which in themselves, as from my understanding, are an extremely complex battleground to fight on. But I would say he has done an extraordinary job. I think Netanyahu, I can't imagine anybody else, whether from Israel or from any other country, who could have achieved the success that Netanyahu has achieved in this fight. I think Israel is extremely lucky to have him. I know he gets a great deal of bad press internally and externally.
Right. There's no one more vilified in the entire world almost than Netanyahu.
Right. And let's not forget as well, I know it's a different situation, and there weren't anything like the kind of the same type of pressures on him, but Winston Churchill was also quite strongly vilified when he was leading the British war effort, and he had parliamentary resolutions against him, resolutions of no confidence, things like that. He came under a lot of fire as well. Nothing like what Netanyahu's got to deal with, and particularly nothing like this legal battle that Netanyahu has to deal with. No, I'm not just talking about his own court cases, but the ICC, the ICJ.
The arrest warrants.
Right. So, I have huge admiration for a man like that who can achieve so much with such tough opposition from every direction.
And you've met the Prime Minister on several occasions.
I have, yeah.
What would be something about the Prime Minister that impressed you that probably most people don't know?
I would say one thing about him is, the last time I saw him was a few months ago, after he'd been directing a war over, at that time, well over a year anyway. And he looked like he'd just come back off vacation. He was relaxed. He was didn't look tired. He was on top of everything that was going on. In a way, it sort of reminded me of Thatcher, because I know that Thatcher, whether she was directing war or not at the time, used to survive on just 2 or 3 hours sleep a night. And I think he does the same, yet still manages to maintain not only his sanity, but also the control. And I think also the other thing I would say about him from my observation is his mastery of the detail, which, well beyond what I would have expected, of every single detail of the conflict, of each of the, and don't forget, Israel's been fighting on 7 battlefronts, as well as the media war and as well as the political dimension. Yet he had complete mastery of all details.
Israel's now in a place where it looks like fighting is about to resume in Gaza, has even begun to resume. There's a ceasefire more or less holding in southern Lebanon, but there's been a few exchanges that may challenge the long-term validity of such a ceasefire. We're seeing the United States now attacking the Houthis deep inside Yemen. And of course, the head of this terror octopus, Iran, still looms large as they race towards nuclear weapons breakout illegally. What do you foresee in the coming weeks and months ahead, and what does Israel need to do to achieve what the Prime Minister has alluded to as total victory? Well,
total victory has got to be achieved over Hamas in Gaza, and I think all of the other different fronts you're talking about have got to be obviously dealt with concurrently, particularly Iran, the head of the octopus, that's got to be suppressed or changed or something, but that can be, and that potentially could be done through economic pressure from the US. I'm not overly confident on that. I think ultimately we'll have to rely on Israeli military operations inside Gaza in order to end the nuclear threat, in order to prevent this region-wide aggression that's been taking place. So that's a very high priority. But as far as when we talk about, when the Prime Minister talks about total victory, he's referring particularly to Gaza. And I think his concept of total victory was very much aided by President Trump and his call to evacuate the population of Gaza, 2 million people, something like that. That sounds an impossibility, and I'm not overly optimistic it's going to happen. But one thing we should remember is, when you're talking about in practical terms, is that at the beginning of the war between the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 2 million Ukrainians left Ukraine and went next door to Poland. That hasn't happened, obviously, in relation to Egypt, and I think that's been a real problem. Egypt should have opened its borders like every other country, pretty much every other country does, to allow civilians to escape a battlefield. It has legal obligations to do that under the International Refugee Convention and the African Union Refugee Convention. It hasn't done it. Now, I can understand why Egypt doesn't want to take 2 million Gazans into its territory. I can understand that. But the thing that puzzles me is, why has there been no pressure by the international community to encourage or offer assistance to Egypt to do that? And I see that as being, the reason for that as being because, like Hamas, so many people in the international community see Gazans as human shields. They don't want Israel to defeat Hamas in Gaza. They want to use the civilian population to prevent that happening. So they're not particularly enthusiastic about getting the Gazans out. And I think a couple of other, what I consider to be interesting observations. From the world, we've heard Gaza is a concentration camp. It's an open prison. Yet when Trump suggests moving the people out, that's a war crime. So it's an open prison, but the prisoners have got to stay. When they talk about genocide, if you can't stop an attacking force, which is not committing genocide, but is accused of it, then get the people that are at risk of genocide out of it. But they don't want to do that either, which, exposes the lie of the whole genocide thing. So I think the Trump's call to get the Gazan civilians to leave Gaza, I think has kind of in many ways overturned the thinking that's been going on in this region for such a long time. And it's the first time that I know of, it's the first time when any US president has demanded some kind of concession from the Arabs. Always it's Israel must give this, Israel must do that, Israel must do the other. Never the Arabs. This time things are being demanded of the Arabs. And that's, I think that whether it will have lasting effect, I don't know, but it sort of almost changes the paradigm to an extent.
Well, obviously, that's going to definitely, that would change the paradigm completely if Gazans were not in the Strip. And then the other question is, who controls Gaza after? Is there any force, be it Palestinian force, the Palestinian Authority, any kind of conglomeration of Arab states or any other international force that Israel could trust to govern or to ensure the security inside the Gaza Strip, or is really Israel the only logical choice to govern and provide sovereignty and military over Gaza?
I think Israel has to maintain the security of the Gaza Strip. It cannot rely on anybody else to do that. Nobody at all. Not the Americans, not Arab countries, certainly not things like the United Nations. It has to maintain security control. There are options, I think, for governance of Gaza. They don't include the Palestinian Authority, in my opinion. The Palestinian Authority is the enemy of Israel. The Palestinian Authority has been, for decades, the Palestinian Authority has been indoctrinating its people to hate Israel. They've been paying terrorists to carry out attacks against Israel and compensating the terrorists that die in the process and their family. These are not, in my view, partners for peace inside Gaza. But there are other options, and that includes Arab countries, for example, the UAE, possibly Egypt, other Arab countries who may have a role to play in the governance of Gaza. But if that doesn't materialize, then I think the IDF or Israel, including the IDF, is going to have to take responsibility for governing Gaza.
What would you say is the danger for Israel, for the entire region, and for that matter, you alluded to Western society as well, if Israel for some reason does not complete the battle and does not achieve total victory?
Well, I think it's basically, if that doesn't happen, and I believe it will happen, and I don't go along with the view of people who say you can't defeat Hamas because Hamas is an idea, it's an ideology. Well, maybe it is, but an ideology is almost irrelevant if you've destroyed its weaponry and it's the people who are able to present a danger as a result of that ideology. The
Right.
ideology of Nazism was never destroyed. But
We've heard we've heard the prime minister say, okay, maybe you can't destroy an idea, but an ideology should not have a land that it controls,
Right.
nor the military ability to carry out their ideology.
Right, exactly. But I think if that doesn't come about, if the destruction of Hamas in Gaza doesn't come about, we're then back to two things. We're back, first of all, to a repeat performance again in, I don't know, in a few months or a few years, whatever it might be, as we've seen time and time again from Gaza. And secondly, it's going to have a big impact on the Western world, and not just the Western world, but the Middle East as well. In the West, it's going to a non-victory for Israel. In other words, the success or the continued existence of Hamas is going to encourage international jihad. There's no question it's going to make the West a much more dangerous place, and it's already a very dangerous place from the threat of jihad. And the Middle East, I think, part of destroying destroying Hamas rather, and dealing with Iran and the other proxies in the region, is to protect the Middle East as a whole. And Arab countries, most of whom, whatever they might say in public, Arab countries have been on the side of Israel in this fight. And they want Israel to win. They want Israel to defeat Hamas because they know that Hamas represents a big danger to their country, the whole Muslim Brotherhood threat in the Arab world. They know also that Iran represents the big danger. So they want Israel to be successful and effective and victorious over both Hamas, Iran, and the other proxies.
Now, you've spent some time on university campuses in the United States and elsewhere. What's your impression of the state of college students today in the West, and what's been your message to them? And have there been any positive surprises?
I think the too many college students have been indoctrinated by an anti-Israel campaign. It's not even a pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian. It's an anti-Israel campaign, and they've got it in their heads, the evil of Israel and the resistance movements and all the rest of it. They don't know. Mostly, they don't know anything about it. If you pointed to a map, they wouldn't be able to say where Israel was on the map in many cases. But they've got these lines from the river to the sea. They're repeating talking points. They don't know what river they're talking about or sea they're talking about. So there are exceptions to that. Of course there are, and particularly among the Jewish communities on the campuses who I've been very impressed with some of the way they fought back. But I'll tell you about one experience I had on a university campus, which was I gave a talk in a university in the UK, and there was a big protest outside. I'm always disappointed if I'm speaking at a university and there's not a protest. But there was a big protest outside.
Why is that?
Because the people that are protesting are the people that need to be educated and need to be informed about this thing. So if there's no protest, it means, what am I doing there? So this particular protest was, they were protesting outside. I went inside. I gave them a talk. I came out again, went across the road to a pub, which you probably call a bar, I don't know, to a pub across the road, with some of the students that had been in the presentation. And we sat on a long table in this bar. On the next table, there was a long table full of protesters with their placards saying Kemp is a war criminal and stuff like that under the table. And they were sitting there having a beer. And I walked over and sat on their table. And one of the students said, "You can't sit here." I said, "Why can't I sit here?" "Because you're a war criminal." I said, "Well, there's no law against war criminals sitting in a pub." And so this particular student got up and left. The others stayed there, about 10 of them. And I spoke to them for about 2 hours in this bar. And we had a civil conversation. They were putting their view across, I was putting mine across. And at the end of it, several of them said to me, "I don't know if you were telling the truth or not, but I'm now going to look into what you've said and see if it's true." But one thing that they all said was that they'd never, ever, ever heard the argument I'd made, which was a straightforward, factual argument against their position, against the anti-Israel position. But they'd never heard it. They weren't given the ability to, or the option to listen to one side, listen to the other side, balance the argument up, because the universities, and in some cases the high schools, are only telling one side of the story. And if you go and try and tell the other story, very often you get cancelled.
I mean, is it just anti-Israel? Is it also anti-Western?
Anti-Western as well. It's and if you go to look at the protests, you look at the anti-Israel protests, pro-Palestine protests, or whatever, they're all flying Palestinian flags. You look at a counter-protest by, let's say, a Jewish group or a multi-faith group or whatever, you'll see they're flying their national flag, the United States flag or the British flag or whatever. Because these are people who are actually support not just Israel, but their own country. Whereas the protesters and the rabble-rousers among them, including professors and academics, they're anti the West. And Israel is kind of almost symbolic of the West.
What's that going to mean for the future of the West, for the future of the United States, future of the UK?
Well, it's a depressing future, I would say, in that respect. And so many, not just universities, it's government organizations, international organizations, human rights groups, so-called NGOs. They've been captured by this anti-Western narrative and anti-Israel narrative. And it's infiltrated and infected, in Britain anyway, pretty much every area of government. And so unless something could be done, which I'm not optimistic about because there's no sign of it happening, unless something could be done to tell the truth, to get the reality out there, or at least to give balance to the arguments, I think the future is not bright.
You seem, though, optimistic about the future of Israel, and you've obviously spoken to a lot of soldiers who are basically college age, what would be considered United States college age soldiers in the military. You've spoken to students here. What is it about Israelis that leaves you a little bit optimistic about the future of this country when the United States and UK and elsewhere they have other different challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not just a bit optimistic. I'm very optimistic about the future of Israel, and I've, as you say, I've spoken to many IDF soldiers and civilians in Israel, and I've spoken to IDF soldiers in Gaza who've been told you're going to leave Gaza in a day's time. You're going to be rotated. Another unit will come in, and they've protested against that. It's not because they are bloodthirsty, because they're gung ho, nothing like that. It's because they know they're fighting for their families, for their friends, for their countrymen, for their way of life, right on the doorstep of the country. And that brings to it a level of, I think, incentive and morale that you could say, probably fortunately, it doesn't exist in Western countries because they don't have that immediate threat. And I think that's a big motivator. And also, whether they're left, whether they're right, and whatever their political perspective, there is immense pride, I think, in the country, and that's something that we had, but to a large extent, not exclusively, we've lost. And I think that gives me a great deal of optimism in the future. But other things that give me optimism as well. First of all, I think the generations of Israelis now have fought, and in some cases sacrificed, for their country. And history shows us that any country, like, for example, Australia in the First World War or the Second World War, who lost a lot of soldiers, tragic though it was, fighting for their country, it strengthened the country, brought more unity to the country. And I think that will be the case with Israel. And secondly, Israel knows who its enemies and who its friends are. And Israel knows now that it has to be more self-reliant militarily, I'm talking about particularly. And the country's already begun to develop greater self-reliance in its defense industries, and that will strengthen the country. Thirdly, I think the Jewish diaspora, which has not always been as strongly supportive of Israel as it should have been, as it needs to be, because it's so important, the diaspora influence in the countries that they're living in. I think that this has been a wake-up for them, an overdue wake-up, but a wake-up, and I think we'll see a strengthening of the diaspora in different countries, particularly importantly the US. And fourthly, I think, after this terrible setback and tragedy of the 7th of October, Israel's fighting efforts all around the country and, in different combat zones has strengthened Israel's reputation for military capability among Arab countries. And that's earned Israel a lot of respect from the Arab countries and will, I hope anyway, will lead to an extension of the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia. They may say differently now, but I think it will happen. And if that happens, again, Israel's future will be much brighter than it is today.
Well, you see on the streets here in Israel now, there's a lot of discord and political disunity. What would be your message to Israelis about what they've accomplished, what they should do moving forward? And what would also be your message to Prime Minister Netanyahu if you were going to meet him now? What would you tell him?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's completely understandable that, I know I'm a goy myself, but I know a fair number of Jews, and I know there's rarely an agreement between Jews, so I can see why there should be so many differences of opinion. But what I would say is that their country and their young men and women and older men and women who have been fighting and dying in some cases and getting seriously wounded, they've been doing a remarkable job for Israel. And they need to be given every encouragement, backing and support from the population of Israel to continue doing that job. And I think, I'm not an expert on Israeli internal politics. I don't really understand a lot of the debates going on. I can understand why there are concerns and issues over numerous things, but I'm afraid that really ought to be. And I'm not someone who's going to come here to Israel and tell the Israelis what they should do, but I think they should seriously consider putting as much of their political difficulties as they can aside until this war is won. If I was to walk into Prime Minister Netanyahu's office today, I would tell him to keep doing what he's doing.
Colonel Richard Kemp, a great defender of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. Thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for being here on JNS.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Alex.